It's wintertime again, a season that I personally love more than all others. It's the time for a nice cozy fire, a glass of hot chocolate, and time to do nothing else but spend with your friends and family.
Yes, it certainly is. But that's not the reason why I like the thought of winter. I like the idea that spring is on its way, a time of rebirth and all things new.
Cool. On the subject of new things, right after spring is summer, then fall, which in this begins something new for Norman.
That's right. It's the new Norman High North, and here to tell us about the new school and how to establish them is Dr. Judy Barber with Focus on Learning.
Welcome to Focus on Learning. In the fall of 1997, as on many shows you've seen on this channel this year, 6 new schools will be established, some of them in new buildings, some of them in existing buildings. And I thought it'd be interesting for us to talk to some people who have established new schools. So we have Carla Kimberling, who's at Roosevelt Elementary School, and Glenda Peters, who's at our new Catholic school. And the name of that school is, Glenda?
All Saints Catholic School.
Yeah, thank you all for joining me. I remember, even though it's been 5 centuries ago, starting 2 schools. I was at Kennedy School when it started, which was in 1968, which was the year the Catholic school closed,
Yes.
wasn't it? So
Yes, it was.
Right. And Eisenhower School, which opened in 1973, and the jillions of decisions that had to be made. And I thought we could just talk about some of those today as it comes to your mind. But first, let's just talk about the purposes of schools, because a parish school, would that be a correct term?
Yes.
And a public school do have different purposes. So, Carla, talk a second about, just from your point of view, what is the purpose of your public school?
Well, our school at Roosevelt was opened in the fall of '93, and we had extreme growth on the west side of town, and so that was a way to really alleviate some of the overcrowded conditions at Cleveland and at Adams School. So when we opened Roosevelt, it was for the purpose of trying to distribute the population more equally in our public schools.
And it's truly a neighborhood school.
Yes, it
and our
is.
public schools in Norman, that's the way we're organized, is to serve the children of the parents who live within our area. Even though we
Exactly.
have some transferring of kids, that's where it is.
Exactly.
But with a religion-based school, it gives people a choice. And so, Glenda, talk a second about the purpose of your school.
We have 3 purposes at the Catholic school. The first, of course, is to educate our children. And we realize that the parents are the primary educators, and so our role as teachers in the Catholic school is to bolster and to support the teaching that goes on at home. And of course, that would be a combination of the reading, writing, and arithmetic classes, along with another R, religion. So one of our purposes is to bolster the teaching that's occurring at home and to offer our professional expertise at the school level regarding helping the students to progress through their careers as students. Second, we are there to teach our faith and to reinforce Christian values and looking holistically at the development of the child, realizing that there is a spiritual aspect to everybody's development. And then finally, a third firm purpose, and part of our curriculum is service to community. And in our school we have 4-year-olds, so they might serve within the school itself. And then as students become older, you would see outreach into the community and the state.
All right. So your purposes are very much like ours, with the exception, of course, stressing of faith, which we don't do in a public school. But no matter what the purpose of the school, anytime you establish a new school, the millions of decisions that have to be made, and I just jotted down these categories, that all of the things that have to be arranged, the people that need to be organized, and the policies that need to be followed, and then practices and procedures, and then of course the money. So let's just start with things. What comes to your mind when you thought about, when you were first establishing your schools, what things had to be?
Well, I was just amazed at the number of things that I had to think about. And then I think what I worried most about was, what did I forget? I remember one day getting a phone call from someone in our district saying, Carla, have you ordered the stop signs for your school? Well, I didn't even think about some of the really small things that we just take for granted every day that are there. So I had to really walk through an existing school with different eyes and look at everything that we would need, you know, from pencil sharpeners to chalkboards to the obvious desks and chairs and things like that. But also impacting the decisions on things are the way we teach. So we had to really look at purchasing different kinds of things. Nowadays we are looking at active learning, and so we're purchasing more manipulatives. We're doing a lot of resource-based teaching, so we're looking at purchasing lots of things for the teachers to work with and teach with. So it really was mind-boggling at the time, the amount of things that we had to think about purchasing.
Okay.
So true, and very much the same. We were discussing one day how we would use the school intercom system, because there had been a school here 30 years earlier, so we walked down the hall to do the test from the main Head Start into the classrooms. We realized that even though the visible equipment was there, the lines had been removed. So then we were into getting up into the ceiling and creating those, all of the details, some of which you can remember and some that you don't miss, like good health, until it's not there.
Well, so from pencils and paper clips to computers to ice machines
To desks for teachers.
To desks for teachers.
Chairs for teachers. Rugs, because the tile isn't quite as clean as you might like it to be, and you want to make the environment as healthy as possible. So many details to think about.
Right.
And a real important thing that happened at the time we opened Roosevelt was technology and what direction to go with technology. So we really had some big decisions to make at that time concerning, do we want a computer lab? Do we want computers in the classrooms? Can we possibly be networked? So that was a whole new focus in our district at that time.
It really does take a long time to generate all of the decisions that need to be made and then make them and then to get onward with it. So starting early is important. Well, we could go on about things for a long time, but now let's go to people. What comes to your mind when we go to that category?
Finding just the absolute best, because of course the faculty and the staff with whom the students work make our jobs very different. So you have to look for those very best people. And for us, it was finding a balance, because we really do believe in the importance of nurturing beginning teachers who are just beginning their career. But in establishing a new school, you also want to know that you can rely on some people who have walked through some of the issues that we touch on every day in teaching. So finding those people, taking the time to interview them, perhaps observe them in present teaching situations, was one very important beginning point for us.
And Carla, what about you?
Well, in that whole process of opening a new school, I think hiring the staff was the most time-consuming and the most important thing that I did during that whole process. And it was a little different from the way I've usually done in the past as a principal, because I didn't have a staff to help me interview at that time. So I was conducting the interviews by myself, and I was trying to view this person that I interviewed through lots of different eyes, not only as an administrator, but as a classroom teacher. What would this person be like to be a co-teacher with? Those kinds of things. And it was really a difficult time to do all of that, but it was really important that it be done thoroughly.
Okay, and let's go to the policies. For Carla and I, when we opened our schools, we had the Norton Board of Education policies that were in place. What about for you, Glenda?
There is the Archdiocesan set of guidelines and policies, and those provide the framework in which we operate. And then, of course, bringing that to the local level, because each parish school is an entity in and of itself. So we also have a school board, and we work very closely with members of our board in establishing those policies, some of which were created as we opened, some of which we're discussing as the year evolves.
And no matter what the policies are, as you were talking about individual schools, there are practices and procedures that have to be put in place that are dictated by the people who live there and the building itself. What's a practice that comes to your mind that you had to establish?
Well, one thing I think about is just the little part of getting to the cafeteria during the day, which door we go in, how we have our lunch procedure, all of those kinds of things. Our playground procedures, what happens at recess, how do the children line up, where do they line up? Things that are really not important in the scheme of things, but they are important when they're not working right.
Right. That's correct. Linda, what about
And
you?
for us, we had wonderful ideas about what we wanted to do. So making a reality of a concept. For example, we wanted to have morning prayer assembly where the entire school would gather together for that purpose. So we had an idea, and until all of those warm bodies show up and you invite parents in, you really cannot make some decisions until you're living in your new home. So that's both a challenge but makes our work exciting.
And as you were establishing those practices, did you make those decisions or individually, or how did they come about?
Teamwork.
Teamwork, exactly. And at Roosevelt, we had the staff hired in the spring before school opened in the fall of '93. So we did have some opportunity to meet as a group. We set our mission statement, we looked at our common goals to work on together. And we talked about a lot of those things. But then also as the year went on, just as you're probably experiencing now, there would be things that would come up that we would have to quickly call team meetings and make some decisions as a group. But it's really important that all the stakeholders are involved.
Right, cooperation, so important. Well, let's talk about money just a second. I went back and looked to see about when we built Eisenhower School, and I noticed that at that point we were building for $18 a square foot. That's very different now. But no matter how much the money is, it comes from a variety of places. And so, Carla, when you first began Roosevelt, the Norman Public Schools dedicated funds toward doing that.
Right, and those funds were a result of a bond issue. So we were fortunate to have the bond issue to complete not only the construction, but to purchase the furnishings and the materials.
All right. And Glenda, from monies outside of the school itself, were there for you for a startup?
Yes, similarly with just a different institution at our support base. So the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City has made possible the renovations and the remodeling. We're currently building 2 new mobile portable classrooms. And so we look to that kind of support from the archdiocesan level, and then the 3 parishes here in Norman also subsidize our school.
And then, of course, individually, schools do their own fundraising with their parents to add to all of that. Well, I want to thank both of you for just giving us a touch of all the decisions that have to be made when you establish a school, and say to both of you, because I've been in both of your schools, that they both are very, very similar in the feeling and also in the solid education that kids receive. And that's what we're all about in education, is truly teaching and educating children. So thank you for all the time that you have spent with them and for joining me on Focus on Learning.
Thank you.
And to our audience, thank you for joining us on Focus on Learning.
Oh, here.
Okay, this week's district update will focus on the Board of Education meetings, which deal with bonds and what to do with them. Let's go now to Mrs. Connie Blaney for a district update.
Good evening. The Norman Board of Education held a special board meeting at 3 p.m. on Thursday, December 5th. At this meeting, the board authorized a resolution calling for a special election on February 11th for the purpose of submitting to the registered voters the issuance of bonds for Norman Public Schools. Building and equipment bonds in the sum of $2,400,000 to be sold in April and $4,900,000 in bonds to be sold in December of 1997. Both issuances will be used to provide funds for the purpose of acquiring and improving school sites, constructing, repairing, and remodeling of buildings, acquiring school furniture and equipment, and technology. The voters will also vote on $300,000 in transportation bonds to purchase school buses and other vehicles. In the past, school bond issues in the district have normally been held in October. This bond issue will be held earlier in 1997 so that the school district can sell a portion of the bonds in April and receive funds which will allow us to complete construction projects needed in the next year. The February 11th bond election date is also the same time as the annual school millage election and school board election. The millage election must be held each year by law and must be voted by the people in the Norman Public School District. Patrons in this election will vote for the 5 1/8 mil building fund levy, the 10 mil local support levy, and the 5 mil emergency fund levy. Funds from the emergency levy and the local support levy assist with the day-to-day operating expenses of the district. The building fund levy is used to repair and update buildings and to purchase equipment and furniture. These levies do not increase taxes. Voters residing in Office Number 2 area, which is located in the central part of Norman, will be voting on the board seat being vacated by Tom Clote Jr., president of the board. He has announced that he is not seeking re-election. The following dates were held this week for this office. I will give you names of who filed for this post in next week's update. The Personnel Transition Committee is now meeting to review employees' requests for where they want to work next school year. The committee will evaluate certain criteria and hopes to notify the employees by the end of December of their new assignments. Some assignments may have to be changed depending on enrollment numbers next fall. The State Department of Education has approved the district's request for 2 1/2 days of in-service for the employees of Norman schools. These dates for the school improvement exemptions are February 28th and April 11th. There will be no school for the students in the afternoons on these 2 dates. The winter break schedule is set for Friday, December 20th through January 1st. Classes will resume on Thursday, January 2nd. The next Board of Education meeting will be held on Monday, December 16th in the Administrative Services Building at 131 South Flood at 7 p.m. The public is invited to attend. Until next week, I'm Connie Blaney for Norman Public Schools.
Now here's Norman's Teacher of the Year, Linda Kramer, who opens a door to word processing for her students on Opening Doors.
Today we'll visit one of my favorite places at Central, our Macintosh lab. Last week we saw how teachers use computer technology to produce professional-looking brochures for their classes. But the best work in a computer lab is done by the students. Today, Sandra Effinger, a 10th grade English teacher at Central, has brought her class to the lab. As she instructs them, using a computer hooked up to a monitor, the students produce reports based on stories they've been reading. Placing text blocks, inserting clip art, justifying margins, enlarging the font, accessing spell and grammar checks, saving as to their disks, and laser printing their copies keeps the students busy for the entire class period. Just as the bell begins to ring, the laser printer jams. That's what happens sometimes when 25 students all try to print at once. It's good that Casey Shaw, computer lab expert at Central, is there to lend a hand.
I'm here in the Central Computer Lab with Sandra Effinger, and boy, it was busy this hour.
It was busier than I thought it was going to be, actually, because most of them got more done than I expected.
Can you tell us what we saw?
Okay, this was our second visit to the lab. They were actually revising their first drafts of their fairy tales, had done adaptations, and most of them got to a point where they could worry with details like putting in headers and footers and artwork. They all got to proofreading. It was really nice. It was really impressive.
I noticed that they were doing things like inserting and doing all these pretty sophisticated computer skills. And this is only your second visit?
Well, that's probably because they came in last year. These are sophomores, so they have had an advantage. And we have a number of people in this class who, up front, said they were pretty familiar with computers to start with.
You were working really hard, and Mrs. Shaw, the lab expert, was working very hard to try to help everyone. Why do you do this? Why do you work this hard? Why don't you just let them do it at home and bring it?
Because they don't all have it at home to bring it, for one thing. That's probably the most important reason we do have the lab.
Well, is there some sort of advantage to doing it on a computer rather than writing out the way I had to in ink?
For some students, particularly for the student who doesn't have great skills, I hate to say that, but that's the person who benefits the most. I myself am not a very good speller, and I like having a spell checker to help me. For a lot of them, the fact that they can put out a final product makes it worth revising, and that's a real important step. A lot of people say that with computers, you almost do too much revising. It's hard to ever be finished.
Right. A kid just complained about that to me today. He had an essay to write over the weekend, and he said that he kept finding more mistakes. Every time he'd print out a copy, he'd go back and fix it and make it better and better and better. And that's a really good skill that they're learning, isn't it?
Absolutely. And they're more likely to expand. There are a lot of writing techniques they won't use if they're worried about that final copy looking pretty and they have to do it by hand.
Right.
They'll add in details, they'll change words, they'll use the thesaurus. They do a lot of nice things with it. I was real impressed.
Great. Well, it was fun watching your kids in here this hour. I think they were having a good time, really.
I think they felt pretty good about the work today.
English classes do use the lab frequently, but all classes use the lab and get great results on their products. Running a computer lab takes lots of money, but our district is committed to providing students with training in technology, training that will prepare students for whatever lies ahead. All of Norman's schools have computer labs. Our district is now working toward the goal of providing a computer in every classroom, which some of our sites have already accomplished. I'm Linda Kramer, and I'll see you next time on Opening Doors.
Thank you, Ms. Blaney. Rex Suba is the Penn Professional Educators of Norman president. He is also one of the Media 2 teachers here at Norman High. This week on his pinpoints, he'll be talking about...
No, don't tell them that.
Oh, well, that will ruin the surprise if I tell you. So here's Rex Suba with his pinpoint.
Welcome to another edition of Penn Point TV. Let's see what's happening around the district for Penn members. The Penn Budget and Salary Committee had its first meeting for the 96-97 school year. Re-elected by consent to their positions were Karen Thomas, Nina Williams, Maggie Milliken, Dan Quinn, Chuck Seepy, Herbert Skidmore, and Mark Stahl. Their first report will be given at a Penn Exec meeting. They are scheduled to meet again in January on the 7th of January. For more information, call the Penn office or log on to the website. The Educator Rights Committee of Penn has also had its first meeting of the year. Members of the committee include Leanne Kennedy, Cindy Overstake, co-chairs Sherry Childress and Karen Wagner. If you have some issues that you would like to bring to the ERC committee, please send it to Penn at the PDC or call 366-1148. Penn will be hosting a candidates forum for the candidates of OEA President and Vice President. This forum will take place at the Norman Public Library on December 19th from 7 to 9. Please call 366-1148 for more information. That's it for these announcements on Penn Point TV. Have a good break.
Thank you, Dr. Barbara, Glenda Peters, and Carla Kimberling.
This past week, the Citizens Advisory Council met and made some decisions.
That they did, and here now to tell us about those decisions is Dr. Dick Schiller and Larry Willoughby on this week's Transition Update.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us on Transition Update. Last month, you may remember, we visited with Mr. Larry Willoughby, the chairperson of the Citizens Advisory Council. We discussed the processes and the procedures that the council was using this year in its study of our district student transfer policy. Larry's back with us again tonight, and we're going to take a look at some of the actual options that the council is considering recommending to the Board of Education. The board would take a look at those options at its January board meeting. Larry, why is the council studying the student transfer policy this year?
Well, Dr. Schiller, as a result of last year's CAC boundary committee, we sort of had the feeling out there that because all the secondary schools will be under capacity when they open next year, that there might be some problems with transfers. We asked the board if they would let us consider that this year, and they said, yes, go right ahead. So at this point, we are trying to consider some transfer options to present to the board in January.
Okay, so it's kind of a logical spin-off then from the attendance boundary study that the council did last year, and really the 2 years before. Makes this just about a 4-year study, really.
That's correct. That is correct.
Okay, what are some of the general areas that the council is looking at including in its recommendation to the board?
Some of the general areas are eligibility, exceptions, proximity, grandfathering, that sort of thing.
Okay. Let's take a look at one of them and discuss the options that the council has discussed so far. How about the issue of exceptions? What does that mean? By definition, I would assume that means we have a transfer policy and the council is proposing that the board consider some exceptions to that policy, perhaps. Is that correct?
That's correct. Our definition of exceptions is someone who will be granted a transfer in spite of the attendance boundary criteria.
That they live in.
That's correct. That's correct. Some of the options we're looking at in the exceptions category are, for instance, no transfers for the transition year 97-98, which would be a short-term issue. We're looking at short-term as well as long-term transfer policies.
Okay.
At this particular point, the CAC is dealing mainly with the short-term. We have not gotten the long-term yet. Okay. We're a couple of weeks away. But no transfers for the transition year would be one. Students living in close proximity to the school would be given consideration. That would be another one. Transportation for students living on their own or the emancipated students would be another. Juniors given a choice is another. And grandfathering students in the 4th, 7th, 11th grades at this point, that would also be.
Those would all fall under the exceptions category. And it's possible under that category that the board could adopt more than one of those exceptions.
That's quite possible. That's quite possible.
Under that category. Okay, let's take a look at another one. Earlier, you mentioned eligibility. What kind of issues could we be dealing with in eligibility as it relates to student transfer?
Okay, eligibility we have looked at, and we are fairly close to completing our work on this particular options issue. What we are considering is eligibility for interscholastic activities. That is athletic as well as academic. It would not only include baseball, but it would also include debate and chorus and band and things along those lines.
Okay. And some of the options that they're considering then under eligibility would include one option that the students.
For instance, the two options that we're looking at this point would be no penalty for transfers the first year.
So anybody would, under that option, if that were adopted by the board, any student would be, who transferred in the first year, 97-98, would be eligible automatically for all activities.
That's correct.
Okay.
And the second
one option.
And the second option under that is 2 semesters of ineligibility for a transfer.
Do you know what's the most common one that's used in other districts like ours around the area?
I believe it's the 2 semesters.
2-semester one is more common.
Yes.
That's what I have heard too. What are some of the pros and cons of those 2 options? Can you go through any of that for me?
Some of the advantages of no penalties for transfer the first year would be the fact that, number one, it would ease the transition. Number 2, no one would be penalized for transferring. And it seems to be quite popular with the public at this point. Some of the disadvantages of that particular option would be that it's inconsistent with the boundary criteria, because we worked very hard in establishing what the criteria was in order to draw the boundary lines over the last 2 or 3 years.
To make a kind of a balance among the schools?
A balance among the schools. It would also set a bad precedent. It would give us a potential imbalance between the schools. It is an administrative nightmare. It could encourage interscholastic, or would encourage interscholastic recruiting. We have, in our studying this particular topic, we have checked with some other school districts in the metropolitan area, and as they opened 2nd and 3rd high schools, they didn't have any kind of policy like this in place, and they would all of one athletic team, for instance, would transfer to the new school, as an example. So it created a particular imbalance in that particular thing. Also, it would exert a little external pressure to transfer and it could result in an unhealthy split between the two schools.
And I appreciate it, and thank you for joining me tonight.
Thank you.
And I thank you for joining us on Transition Updates.